Oh, that works now.
That works now. Okay, yeah. I had to exit full screen. Great. Okay, so snippet of our regional hubs. I'm just going to go back quickly just to show the images of what we were talking about. So these are the types of focus groups that are at our online community. These are the stats from the community. And then the last piece that's just helpful for people to visualize is our theory of change. Like I said, building a community for impact, improving data and methods, and informing effective and just policy. Okay, thanks again for letting me know. So moving forward, before we move on to the logistics, I also just want to thank all of the organizations that support the Carbon Leadership Forum. So some of you are here today. Your sponsorships enable a movement of thousands of leaders to reduce embodied carbon in buildings and infrastructure. So thank you. And the last logistic piece to cover is just this disclaimer. So mention of trade names or commercial products does not constitute endorsement or recommendation for use. Please note the opinions, ideas, products, or data presented by speakers in this session do not represent members of the Carbon Leadership Forum Network or constitute endorsement by the CLF. Our goal is to introduce topics that could help participants think and talk about building industry strategies for reducing carbon emissions attributed to building materials. Okay, and the flow for today's webinar, there we go. We're gonna have 3 10-ish minute presentations, and then at the end, there will be time for everybody to be asking questions and have a bit of a kind of more engaging Q&A. So, as many of you know, policymakers across the United States introduced embodied carbon policies really at an unprecedented rate in the last year. And today we are joined by 3 guest speakers who will share highlights from the recent legislative session and what we can expect to come in the future. So first, we'll have Chris Needle, who will be talking about New York's recent LeCLA bill. Chris is a policy consultant for the National Resources Defense Council, or the NRDC, and the co-founder of Open Air, a global volunteer collective launched in 2019 to advance carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, through member-driven advocacy. In both roles, Chris has helped lead advocacy efforts at the state level related to low carbon concrete procurement policy, including the Low Embodied Carbon Concrete Leadership Act, which is LeCLA, in New York and New Jersey. Chris came to CDR and low carbon concrete from a 15-year career in solar energy, which spanned diverse research, activists, and project management roles in North America, South Asia, Afghanistan, and East Africa. Chris is an upstate New York native and a longtime Brooklyn resident, but he's currently based in Punta Arenas, Costa Rica. Next, we'll have Alex Jackson, who's going to discuss embodied carbon bills in California. Alex joined NRDC in 2009 and currently oversees climate law and policy in California. He has led several legislative campaigns for the NRDC, including enacting California's 2030 statewide greenhouse gas emissions limit and extending its cap and trade program. His areas of focus include carbon markets, energy efficiency, renewable energy, building decarbonization, and short-lived climate pollutants. He's a board member of the California Foundation on the Environment and Economy, CFEE, where he sits on the Energy Steering Committee. Jackson holds a bachelor's degree in environmental policy, history, and government from Cornell University, and a JD from the University of California, Berkeley, and he's based in Sacramento. And our last speaker today is going to be Representative Tracy Burnett, who will discuss Colorado's recent Buy Clean bill. Representative Burnett currently sits on the Energy and Environment Committee, the State Civic, Military, and Veteran Affairs Committee, and the Joint Technology Committee. Of the 10 bills she sponsored and got enacted into law in the 2021 legislative session, 8 were environmental bills, many addressed equity, and several were first in the nation, including HB 21-1303 Buy Clean Colorado, SB 21-264 Clean Heat Plans, and HB 21-1238 PUC Modernized Gas Utility Demand Side Management Standards, all of which will help Colorado meet its greenhouse gas reduction goals. Representative Burnett was recently awarded Colorado's American Institute of Architects 2021 Outstanding New Legislator Award and Healthier Colorado's Leadership Circle Award. In addition, she was a panelist at the prestigious 2021 New York Climate Week, where she talked about the Buy Clean Colorado bill, which we'll hear more about today. And she even mentioned that she talked about the Carbon Leadership Forum at that presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off on to Chris, and we can get started with these presentations.
Excellent. Thanks, Anthony. Can you see here? I'm just going to go ahead and hit present mode. All right. Excellent. Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here with Representative Burnett and with Alex, talking about this subject that me and Alex and Representative Burnett talk a lot about, sometimes together. And also, it's a real honor. I'm the biggest of Carbon Leadership Forum fans. I don't know what we would do without it. So it's excellent to be here talking for you and for your community. So what I thought I would do real quick is just give some background on LeCLA, or the Low Embodied Carbon Concrete Leadership Act, both the policy and the politics, and sort of the history of this effort and how the policy changed because of the politics. I think that's an interesting part of the story. So LeCLA is a bill, as Anthony mentioned, that was introduced in New York originally a couple of years ago. It spanned 2 sessions. And then activists at Open Air, which is the network that that Anthony mentioned, got it introduced in New Jersey. And we also have a few other states that are sort of on the horizon. One that's in the very near term will be introduced for the next session in Virginia. So it's sort of a spreading policy that has sort of changed over time and as it's moved to other places. So what it is like the other bills we'll be talking about today, it's really focused on state procurement of concrete, which is significant. In most states, the state is the single largest purchaser of concrete, so they can have a huge influence through their purchasing decisions that go beyond just the state's concrete. It can have a ripple effect across the state economy as a whole. And LeCLA, we kind of jokingly say there's sort of 3 different iterations of it that sort of appeared over time. So I'll start to sort of go through how those changes were made and why. And the first one, in retrospect, we sort of call it LeCLA Classic. That was the first one that was introduced in New York. And a version of that is introduced right now in November, which we hope will come up for a vote shortly after Thanksgiving. And the LeCLA Classic had 2 main parts. And it was sort of premised on this idea of incenting the adoption of low carbon alternatives for contractors that will be bidding for state projects. So what we did is we looked at a couple of private sector as well as public sector examples in the Netherlands and in the United States. And we landed on this idea of a bid discount, which we thought would be quite powerful, which I'll explain in a second. And then also there's an EPD tax credit, which we basically borrowed almost directly from Oregon, which has a similar program, which is a rebate. And so I'll explain that in a second. But the real idea behind LeCLA, that bid discount, is to create something that we called climate competition, where the global warming potential impact of a bid is factored into the selection process. And the better you compete in that register, the more competitive you become. So we thought that kind of a structure really sort of unleashes, I think, sort of competition and sort of a kind of a market-based approach. And the way we did that is we took global warming potential as a measurement, and we used that as something that would basically trigger what we call a bid discount. And I'll explain what I mean by that. I know this audience is very familiar with what global warming potential is a measurement of climate impact or carbon intensity in environmental product declarations. So we were going to use those numbers as sort of the basis of this particular incentive mechanism. And the way that it basically worked, it's the initial version of it was all voluntary, that you'd have bids that were submitted for state projects that come with EPDs. They would be arranged actually by GWP score, with the lowest GWP score or best on the top. And that would sort of set a discount rate. That bidder would get a maximum 5% discount sort of artificially applied to their price, which would actually make them then appear less expensive or cheaper, and then therefore make them competitive. And 5% is a small discount, but a very meaningful one when you're talking about a commodity like concrete, which these bids are often determined by razor thin price differences. But it wouldn't be just a 5% for the top. We would then sort of distribute discounts based on how the other performers were relative to the leader. So you might have a negligible difference between bid 1 and bid 2, and then therefore functionally they would have the same discount. And then if you don't submit an EPD, obviously you're not eligible for a discount. So that was the main idea. I'm dating myself here with a Kool-Aid man image here to express breakthrough. But we also had another part added to the bill, this discount mechanism, which we wanted to, again, a real goal of this is to keep driving innovation and acceptance of new technologies or methods that are going to continuously over time drive the embodied carbon out of concrete. So we also gave the state the option to designate certain technological categories that they see maybe strategically. There's an interest in trying to advance those faster because they have a higher upside, in terms of their carbon impact or a local economy benefit. So for that, those designated technologies, which could change over time, could get an additional discount rate of up to 3%, depending on what their impact was applied on top of that. So that was how the climate competition piece worked. Now, one of the things that we thought from the very beginning, but certainly became a really important part of the conversation, is how LeCLA is not mutually exclusive at all with a buy clean. In fact, they work really well together, either at the same time or in sequence. They could. You could see we had sort of a light idea on this where you could have, obviously a threshold where, a certain high GWP could not be eligible for any form of discount, even if they had an EPD, or, which is preferable, you could, really harden that into really what, a buy clean model is, that you just develop a baseline threshold that would change over time, that, no bid would be accepted if it's not able to meet that. So you can see how you have the sort of the starting gate of a buy clean sort of mechanism, and then you can add to that this sort of top performance mechanism to drive continuous improvement. The other part, again, tax credit, EPDs, setting them up at concrete plants has a cost to it. In the interest of accelerating adoption and sort of sharing the burden of this transition, we did look to Oregon, which had a $3,000 rebate, I believe, and we did the more New Yorky thing and made that a tax credit. So that was part of it. Now, the politics of this that we faced over that 18 months that we tried to do it in New York, and that what we had, over the last year or so in New Jersey, a couple of things we discovered. General contractors in general, it turns out, hate any kind of preferential bidding criteria for climate or otherwise. So that became a real important sort of form of opposition that we had to deal with throughout our campaign. The ready mix concrete companies, mostly in upstate New York, the kind of local actors, we had a hard time really just engaging on the substance of this at all. So they kind of, their resistance sort of devolved into, people are going to die and bridges are going to fall if this bill gets passed. So that was another form of opposition that we saw. And then we also, somewhat unanticipated, got pushback from some of the local community activists in cement kiln communities that sort of suspected that this might be a way of allowing for municipal solid waste burning at cement plants. There's a number of reasons why we can demonstrate why that wasn't the case, but that did become an important form of opposition that we had to negotiate and work with over time. So based on that, and also what we learned as we went along from all sorts of different folks, including some of the minds at Carbon Leadership Forum, is that there's some changes that we can make to make this policy better over time. And that led to what we called Super LeCLA. And there was drafted version of, these were amendments to the original LeCLA bill that were about to get introduced and would have passed in the Senate, but ultimately got held up in the New York State Assembly. And the first thing that did is it did add some language to the bill itself, which actually specifically prohibited municipal solid waste, tire-derived fuel as a sort of a discount-bearing low carbon factor. And this was very specific to New York, but you'll see this in other places as well. And this was just sort of a political, sort of a compromise, but one that wasn't a very painful one to make. So that was added to the legislation. But the more substantive policy pieces really had to do with how do we make that bid discount truly do what we want it to. And the idea is this is something that will sort of accelerate us to a new place, that if we want more and more layers of innovation to sort of be brought to bear on concrete, if you incentivize that, that's going to sort of get us to the future. But there's certain, if you don't have other policies in place, you have less room to sort of maneuver or do innovative things, even if you wanted to. So we think that there was other sort of policies that we needed to put sort of as jet fuel to make that bid discount particularly beneficial. It was Alex actually who sort of tipped me off to the first one, which is something that's been, sort of part of the discourse for a long time. And that's shifting from a prescriptive-based specifications to performance-based. if it's highly prescriptive, there's obviously few innovations that, you know, a bidder could even really entertain. So if we move to a performance-based specification for concrete that is, you know, based on durability and strength, but gives more latitude for material selection, then you can really start to look more far, you know, more broadly at different innovations. And then another one that we discovered is that even if you have performance-based specifications, you know, there will be a lot of deference anyway to the DOT's approved list of materials. And so you have to accelerate the process and reduce the friction of new materials being evaluated and tested and then, you know, ultimately approved, so that we just keep populating more options when project contractors, you know, look at that list. So we suggested a 6-month expedited review for low carbon materials. The low carbon could be demonstrated through a third party LCA. Certain types of tests you can't rush, but for those we can. We wanted to squeeze out as much sort of bureaucratic uncertainty and time as possible. And so those became the main pieces of Super LeCLA. And then the final piece we added was, let's just go with a threshold to begin with, whether it's more of a Marin County type of design or buy clean, where we would start, you know, take a year with a stakeholder group to define what those, you know, sort of maximum GWPs would be for different mixes. And then discounts would apply to anything that exceeds those sort of baseline thresholds. So that became Super LeCLA, and that was chugging along, about to get passed in the Senate. And we just sort of ran up against a lot of opposition, but really also we ran out of time at the end of the session. So in the last week of June session in New York, we wound up with what we call LeCLA Light, which wasn't optimal, but it was also a good victory that we'll take to fight another day with. And this basically just required the state to convene the stakeholder group and formulate a low carbon concrete standard for procurement. So what we're going to do now in New York is try to influence that process that we got started, but we aim to go back with legislation. We think that the world has changed even since June, and there's even a stronger case for this. So we're going to try to get those policy elements from Super LeCLA back into the conversation through legislation. So that's what's happening in New York. In New Jersey, we feel really good about that. We have amazing sponsors, really, really good support. And we think that right after election, it's going to move through committee in the Senate. It's already moved through it in the Assembly. This is the classic LeCLA. There might be some amendments that are added between now and then that could make it more Super LeCLA-like or more sort of amenable to the New Jersey context. But we are hoping, knock on wood, that we're going to get this one passed in both chambers and hopefully signed into law this year. So we're excited about that. And then Virginia, we're really excited because we have you know, sponsors, and now we're trying to figure out what the actual policy will be that's appropriate for Virginia based on the context there. So that's kind of an overview of what LeCLA is, what the sort of history of it is, how it sort of changed over time and why. And one thing I just want to sort of plug here is that based on all of those learnings, NRDC, myself, and one of my colleagues at Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy, Caleb Woodall, are jointly writing what will be a very readable guide for state low carbon concrete procurement for policymakers. So kind of like again, very sort of readable, sort of broken down all those different elements and, you know, how they sort of work in practice. And we aim to have that out before the end of the year. So I'll certainly circulate it to the CLF community when it's ready. So that's all I have. And thanks so much.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. And I guess I'll have to apologize in advance, folks. I don't have any slides prepared. So in place of Kool-Aid and astronaut and cool things like that, I can maybe show you my 14-year-old cat who's hanging out here with me, but I'll try to entertain you with just the content of my presentation for the moment. So I'm also delighted to be here and very grateful to the Carbon Leadership Forum for all their excellent work, which has been absolutely instrumental to our policy development in this space. So I am new to cement and concrete as an issue area, as you heard from the bio that Anthony read, which I'm sure you all took to heart. I have most of my experience focused on trying to reduce the energy content within the built environment through a variety of means, but less so on embodied carbon. But I think it's clear to all of us that if we're going to have any shot of meeting our climate targets, we need a much more robust, coordinated advocacy approach on these issues. And I'm thrilled to be part of the tip of the spear for some of our work that's starting in California and other states, as Chris went through. So I'm just going to give a backdrop of kind of the lay of the land in California as relates to these issues that sort of informed our thinking as we approach some of the work that we did last year. Then spend most of the time just walking through the two bills that we had sponsored, working with some great legislative champions, one of which passed and one of which was made a 2-year bill, but I think we still made a lot of progress. And high level, kind of one of them focused on a net zero strategy for cement. One of them focused on a buy clean public procurement approach for clean concrete. And then I'll just talk about kind of what's next and what are some of the issues that are still pending, and would certainly welcome the input and perspective from everyone on this call as we chart our way forward. So California certainly been a climate leader on so many issues, but when it comes to industrial policy directly, we don't have a lot that's really looking across the cement concrete supply chain to unlock some of the exciting innovations that we're starting to see bubble up. We are the second largest cement manufacturing in the country after Texas. We have 7 cement plants currently operating, owned by 5 different companies. It's down from 11 just a few years before. We've seen some consolidation and some plant closures. And we have more than 300 concrete producers in California. It is our second largest industrial source of greenhouse gas emissions, but after oil and gas production, but it is just less than 2% overall. So I think mindful of how we approach climate policy at the subnational level, in any sector, really the prize here is, can we prove out policies that can scale and have an impact on the global issue of climate change while we can still lead by example. We do have cement under our cap and trade program, which has been operating since 2013. But I think, as we now know, we can't really rely on carbon pricing alone to overcome a lot of these barriers that we see, so many of which are not really responsive to a price signal, certainly at the level that we've been able to sustain at the state level. So we kind of approach this landscape mindful that we need stronger tools, both on the cement and the concrete side, because I don't think there's really one policy here that can take us to where we want to go and get us to the place of astronauts, per Chris's helpful presentation. So that kind of got us to where we were at the beginning of last year. And the high level, we wanted to pursue policies that could both provide a regulatory push on cement plants directly, mindful that the Air Resources Board already collects data for those plants through the cap and trade system. There's a relatively small number of them. And of course, overwhelmingly, most of the carbon in concrete is from cement. But we didn't want to only focus on cement. As everyone on this webinar likely is well aware, there's so much reduction opportunity simply by using less cement in concrete and other materials, just being more efficient and moving away from these ingredient-based specifications that kind of lock us into business as usual. So rather than try to run one big bill or one policy, we kind of split it out. And the cement bill was SB 596. This was championed by State Senator Josh Becker, who's new to the legislature, but really strong on these issues and comes with some expertise. And this bill requires a net zero strategy for all cement used within the state as soon as possible, but no later than 2045. And with an interim target to reduce the carbon intensity of cement at least 40% by 2035. And the Air Resources Board will be tasked with developing this strategy. It's due by July 1st, 2023. And they'll have to begin implementing it soon after. So notable features, I think. One, the standards apply to all cement used within the state, not just produced, which is important. I think California does import a lot of cement, particularly during boom times. And, given the supply chain issues here and that cement is a tradable commodity, it was important that we ensure that this does provide a level playing field, both for leakage protection and just to be able to create a policy template that's attractive and exportable. And for the first time in California law, the Air Resources Board is directed to evaluate a border carbon adjustment as one tool to kind of develop and craft this strategy. I think there's a lot of concern with net zero approaches without any sort of parameters or guidelines around what counts in terms of netting out some of the residual emissions. So we put in a provision that for this bill, this really is limited to the cement sector. It will not be crediting contributions from outside of the concrete cement supply chain. So, while we certainly need to expand our focus on carbon removal and natural solutions, we're not going to allow crediting from forest projects to count towards these targets, for example. And the interim target was a real sticking point politically with the industry. But so we settled on that interim target of 40% by 2035, but the Air Resources Board will reevaluate it in 2028 and adjust it upward or downward based on the kind of progress that we've made in technology deployment and policy design. And then we adopted some criteria to inform the strategy that the Air Board will develop to kind of prioritize actions that can leverage state and federal incentives, mindful of the opportunity of 45Q, and ensuring that we're not going to be pursuing fuel switching strategies at cement plants like Chris talked about that could potentially exacerbate local air pollution concerns, which was important. Particularly for that small child behind me, excuse me, but she feels very strongly about municipal solid waste burning. So just procedurally, I think went into this process thinking we were certainly going to be on opposite sides with the cement industry, but I have to say they had released their own white paper charting out a roadmap to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045, and I think through the conversation and discussion, there wasn't as much daylight as we might have imagined. So I think we initially in the draft legislation had talked about
Yeah, we can't hear you, Alex. It looks like there's a kind of maybe Wi-Fi glitch right now. Maybe wait a second and see if he comes back. Chris, I don't know if it's possible for you to send up a chat, just knowing that you all have.
Yep, I will do that.
You might be checking. Thank you. Oh, looks like you're back, Alex. Yeah. Okay. You said initially in the first legislation or in the first draft, and then we lost you.
Okay. Yeah, apologies, everyone. We had initially directed the Air Resources Board to evaluate a clean product standard as kind of our main policy workforce to achieve the targets in the bill. But I think we just hadn't done enough to kind of socialize that as a concept, and the mechanism was kind of detracting from the message, both with the Air Resources Board, the administration, and other stakeholders. So the enacted version of the bill doesn't preclude that being a potential policy solution, but we removed that. And the other sticking point was really just on the strength of the interim target. But again, mindful that here we are in 2021, I think we're going to learn a lot as we go forward, and agree that we need to address a lot of the barriers which are at the local level for some of these projects to move forward. We felt okay that as long as the Air Board could adjust that target upward or downward, it was a reasonable accommodation to approach implementation with the industry willing and not dragging their feet in a litigation mode, which we just don't really have time for. So that's the skinny on SB 596, the net zero cement bill. That bill did pass. The other bill was at a high level really an attempt to fold concrete into ByClean. As many on this call likely know, the initial California ByClean law, which passed 4 years ago, did not include concrete or cement. But we didn't want to just kind of add concrete to one of the list of eligible materials or covered materials. I think given some of the limitations in that original law, For example, it requires facility-specific EPDs, which really just don't work for concrete. And it doesn't really provide much of a performance incentive to exceed the minimum or the maximum GWP thresholds, which operate as a minimum. And we also wanted to try to impose a little bit more rigor on what is considered a compliant EPD, really building off the work of the Carbon Leadership Forum. You'll see a lot of familiar text if you look at our proposed bill as some of the bills that they've worked on in Washington State. So I'll just walk through some notable features of this law. This law started out as an assembly vehicle with then Assemblymember Rob Bonta. He was appointed Attorney General during the legislative session. So part of the reason the bill was made a 2-year bill is we had to kind of find a new author and do some procedural machinations, which just gave us a little bit shorter rope to work with when we were dealing with amendments and opposition. But as I said, so one of the features of the bill is we're trying to move towards supply chain specific data and away from industry averages for what is considered a compliant EPD for concrete products. We also were going to be directing the relevant state agencies to establish maximum GWP for concrete products by performance class and by project region, mindful of the diversity in concrete products and just that there's significant variation in access to certain constituent materials throughout California. So we were going to have different maximum GWP thresholds set within each of the 12 districts for our Department of Transportation. We were pursuing kind of a phased in approach by project size. So really starting with larger projects of 500 cubic yards or more, and then lowering down over time just to kind of ease the burden for smaller concrete producers. And then we wanted to give a role for the Air Resources Board in actually setting these emission thresholds because the Department of General Services, which currently is implementing BiClean or is supposed to implement BiClean, just really has no experience, capacity, or history in some of this work. So we felt like that was important. I'd say one of the parts we really tripped up on though was how to provide this performance incentive. And I think as Chris noted, the general contractors really strongly resisted trying to do this at the time of bidding. So that's kind of one of the issues we're going to be working through this fall. There are some examples in California of providing, for example, Caltrans or Department of Transportation provides an incentive to contractors for pavement smoothness, which provides an emissions benefit. So I think we're looking at models that might be able to provide an incentive after a bid is awarded, but we still want to make sure that it's meaningful and try to pull forward some of these, make sure that it's enough of an incentive that we're not just kind of providing an additional payment for business as usual. So that's one of the issues that we're working with in the fall on the BiClean approach. On the cement bill, the kind of onus is going to shift towards implementation. The Air Resources Board will be finalizing our state's overall climate blueprint next fall, and then kind of at the same time initiating the proceeding to develop the policy content for 596. And I think there again, we're facing some decision points. I think there's a question about, do we need a new, strong, robust policy that could potentially be pretty complex, like trying to do a low carbon cement standard, and have that be the template that others could potentially replicate? Or could we really try to focus on pulling some of the existing levers available in California through our other policies and just try to expedite really the deployment of some of these technologies and let that be what we transfer to other jurisdictions? So those are some of the tension points, but I'll stop there and happy to field questions. But made a lot of progress. I have a lot more work to do, and we'll definitely need the support of everyone on this webinar to succeed. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. And last, we have Representative Burnett to talk a little bit more about what's been happening in Colorado. And you're muted right now. Here, I can.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being on this webinar. I don't have slides, but hopefully I can make this talk interesting. Anyway, yeah, my Buy Clean Colorado bill was passed and signed by the governor in July. And I just have to start out, I think what's so important is that we not only talk about the technical side of things, but what it really, how do we get support behind these kind of bills? And so I always start out by saying that my favorite part of this whole bill was, there I was at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night, talking to all my colleagues on the House floor about concrete. And I think, oh my gosh, who the heck cares about concrete at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night? And so I said, this is, okay. I said, the processes used to manufacture concrete and steel represent 14% of the total worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. And if cement were a nation, it'd be the third largest emitter in the world. That's why you care about this bill. And so I think it's so important to make that connection between, what we wonky people talk about and how we get support for people who do not even understand what concrete is. So that really opens things up. So this bill, Buy Clean Colorado, House Bill 1303, it directs the state architect and the Department of Transportation to develop policies that use greener construction materials in state-funded buildings and transportation projects. And also to strive to achieve continuous greenhouse gas emissions over time. Now, for the state, I broke it out into two different pieces because architects understand the whole idea of embodied carbon. It's a new thing for the transportation industry. In fact, as I was stakeholding this whole bill, I kept telling, especially the people in the transportation community, we are building the airplane as it's taking off. I get it. And so I actually had two tracks for this, a shorter track and more precise track for buildings than I did for transportation. So for buildings, it directs the state architect to identify what the maximum GWP for classes of materials, and over time reduce that maximum GWP. So the materials for both transportation and for building include concrete, cement, steel, asphalt, glass, and wood. And so this is the first time in the US that we have concrete and asphalt in that it's actually been passed. So it's pretty cool that way. Some of you might ask, well, why do you have concrete and cement separated out? And I just have to say it's sausage making. It was very difficult, especially for the transportation community, especially ready-mix concrete. This is a whole new concept to them. And so it really doesn't make a difference in terms of policy, but it made a difference in terms of politics. And so that's why those two are separated out. But in terms, I hope you can still hear me. Okay, it just said the internet's unstable. In terms of what I did for the Department of Transportation is I let them define what those policies are. And I did not say it had to be a maximum GWP. The reason is they needed more time. They wanted to do things like look at the durability and the strength and what is the best material that that optimizes both GWP and durability on a per mile basis. Is it asphalt here? Is it concrete there? What are those things? So they are starting out with doing pilot projects in this area, and they have a little bit more time to define these policies. But they are requiring right now, as next year, that bidders who win contracts, they must submit EPDs. And so they're helping the transportation community really get their head around this whole idea of EPDs and how to do it. So let's see. So some of the supporters, again, architects really get this idea. And so it was pretty easy to get the American Institute of Architects on board. They were very supportive of this, as well as some of, we have Lafarge Holcim right here in Colorado. And so it was Jobs for Colorado, and they were very supportive. And I have to say, the Carbon Leadership Forum was instrumental in terms of educating me and educating my stakeholders on this whole idea. They actually came and presented information on what is an EPD, demonstrated tools like the EC3 tool that Building Transparency uses. And these kind of things really helped educate none of the stakeholders. I'd also have to say the Blue-Green Alliance, which is looking at both labor, the intersection of labor and environment, they were very, very helpful in putting this bill together. Of course, the environmental organizations, I'd have to say a lot of them, not all, but I should say some of them, this is a new idea. I got the recycling community on board because I said, you can lower the GWP of these construction materials by using recycled materials. Well, that got them on board as well. The Colorado Energy Office, it's kind of interesting. We have this greenhouse gas reduction roadmap that was published earlier this year. And it's a sector by sector, transportation, buildings, oil and gas, industrial processes, and I'm thinking the last one, I gotta think, utilities. So we have a sector by sector roadmap for how much we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in each of these areas. Interesting enough, embodied carbon was never put in this at all. It was a big mistake that they did. However, the Colorado Energy Office that put this roadmap together said, this will help us get there. We kind of forgot about it when we put together this roadmap. But the Department of Transportation really came on board too, because they said, this will help us meet our sector specific goals in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Some of the other stakeholders, I think we've already talked about, some organizations like the general contractors, they needed, they really had to get their head around this, especially the smaller contractors. And it particularly difficult for like the Ready Mix Concrete Association and the Asphalt Pavement Association. But interestingly enough, about 3 weeks after this bill was passed, I saw something from the Ready Mix, I'm not the Ready Mix, the Asphalt Pavement Association, a little trade rag they had. They said, hey, Colorado just passed this new bill and it requires these EPDs. We have a free tool and it'll take you only 15 minutes to figure out how to do an EPD in the asphalt business. So that was kind of fun. I mean, they were resistant, but I think they're getting on board, which is really cool. Some of the hard things were not only transportation, but also labor. This is something I see as we go forward, and this whole new idea keeps emerging. Labor was concerned about how good are EPDs from other nations, because so that's a tough one. How good are those standard, those international standards? How well are they applied when we're looking at materials from other nations? The other one they keep trying to push is buy clean, buy American. That is a really, really tough thing, especially from a transportation standpoint, because we have, if we get, for any federal dollars we get for transportation materials, there's this whole issue of preferences. And so here's where I came down on that. Because of the Carbon Leadership Forum, I learned that transportation part of an EPD, the greenhouse gas emissions associated with transporting that material, say from China, steel from China, these kinds of things, for most materials is a very, very small part of the entire embodied carbon associated. In the bill itself, I said that the architect and the Department of Transportation can consider the transportation component, but I left it very nebulous. The only place that it really is a bigger factor is with wood. So, and in fact, that's another area that was a little bit difficult. There's a little controversy between old growth wood and new wood, and which ones, over the life cycle of that wood product, which one sequesters carbon, and trying to protect old growth wood. The issue was there's not a standard for how we do that And so I just told the wood representatives, go back and work on a standard. So let's see, some of the other things. Okay, so what I do want to talk about too is people would, I got a lot of questions about, well, does this cost anything? And I pointed to a Rocky Mountain Institute case study in which they did, in which they looked at the embodied carbon in a number of buildings. And they said you can get as much as a 24 to 46% reduction in embodied carbon with less than a 1% increase in cost. So here's the way I put it. We just have to think differently. It is very possible to do this. Colorado is not only the greenest, home to some of the greenest cement manufactured in the country, but also the greenest steel manufacturer in the country. They use recycled steel. They're going to go 100% renewable energy to power their facility next year. So these are all things that just takes thinking differently. So what are the key takeaways? This is what I use to sell it to my colleagues. By using the state's significant purchasing power, we're talking about $54 billion over the last 10 years just in buildings alone. We can foster the private industry to follow through on this. We're the home to some of the greenest cement and steel manufacturing in the world. So that's good for Colorado's economy. It also fosters circular industries in recycling. The manufacturers here, they recycle steel, they recycle asphalt, they recycle tires. Old tires are used in processes here in Colorado. It's good for public health. So it reduces our air pollution and air toxins. And it also, for Colorado, it creates jobs throughout Colorado. We're talking not only in the urban areas, but in many rural areas as well. And of course, it helps us meet our greenhouse gas reduction goals. So those are some of the things that really sold this bill. I'd have to say I am working on tweaks. In fact, one of them, I'd say we're looking at incentives for the private industry, as well as I just found out yesterday that hemp sequesters about 3 times the amount of carbon per acre of other wood products. And so Colorado we have a pretty good hemp industry here. And so maybe we can expand out what kind of materials are included in this bill. So I'm going to stop there because we only have 6 minutes left, and I absolutely want to answer any questions that anybody has. So.
Thank you, Representative Burnett. I'm just going to share screen again so that way people have information about how to follow up with us if they want to connect more. And in the meantime, I know that we had a couple questions coming in the chat already. I think the first one was while Chris was presenting, and it was around, sorry, I don't see the chat right now, but it was around carbon pricing related to that 5%. I can't even remember the right word for it. Discount that was applied for projects. So I'm just curious, is that something that you have information on, Chris?
We don't have information on that, and part of it has to do with just really the complexity and diversity of concrete. So it's difficult to even identify in any given place for any application what a best in class possibly is relative to a sort of a conventional one. And that complexity of concrete is one of the things that, Alex can weigh in on this. I think it's certainly during the Buy Clean conversations, I think that was one of the justifications, that it's very difficult at the time to capture that kind of a data. I think that the EPD technology has evolved even since then, which opens up more possibilities for monitoring impact. But one of the things that we really kind of committed to with the design of LeCLA from the beginning is we prioritized getting something started that could then start to, by doing it, a lot of learning and rail would sort of be laid within the state that could then open up for more comprehensive policies like a Buy Clean. So we had the idea of, you just have this sort of floating incentive where whoever the best performer is within a particular cohort of bidders would get that, but they've come in with their own EPD. And over time, we would start to accumulate local specific EPD data around the state for different applications, which could then be the basis of a threshold that you could add as well. So anyway, that's a meandering response to a very simple question, but the way it was designed, we didn't really sort of try to or need to really do the calculation that Scott had mentioned.
Also in the chat, we've got, I don't know, maybe 5 questions from Scott Hatfield. Scott, do you want to maybe pick one of them, since we've got about 3 minutes left, whatever one felt most interesting and pressing to kind of get a response from the speakers who are here right now? Feel free to unmute yourself if you're here. Toxics. Okay. So I think that so the earlier question was, due to binding exposure to toxics in concrete can be low in standing construction. However, dust is a big concern. Workers have required vacuums for any cutting or drilling in the last 5 years. There are other exposure routes as well. So related to toxics, is there, I'm reading that as a bit more of a comment than a question, but I don't know, maybe the speakers have something to respond related to that.
I just have to say that what we're looking at in terms of in Colorado, in terms of the EPDs, we're looking at the, it's not so much exposure, but I mean, believe me, I totally get it on toxics, but it's what are those greenhouse gas emissions that are created in the process of extracting and manufacturing these products. So I see that Scott has as much of our asphalt comes from refining tar sands, oil, and is that including that? I would say that asphalt, you know, it requires the A1 through A3, which is, you know, from the time that the material is extracted, the raw materials are extracted through the manufacturing process. So I would say that tar sands contribution would be included in that because it would be part of the A1 to A3 EPD.
Great. Thank you, Representative. Okay, well, I see that we're at 9:59. Maybe for the sake of time and making sure that we can finish on time, we can leave it at that. I'm happy to stick around if anybody else has a couple lingering questions about CLF, maybe if any speakers have lingering things that they want to contribute, but officially we can end the webinar at this. And I just want to express gratitude again to Representative Burnett, to Alex and Chris as well for joining us today. It's really exciting how much work has been happening on the embodied carbon policy front in this last year. And we're super excited to help kind of continue the conversation moving forward. So just thanks again for your leadership on this. And thank you to everybody who joined us today.
Thank you.